Okay, good morning, everyone. Now we're on part 2 of Thanksgiving and all the myths and legends that surround Thanksgiving. Last time we learned about foods that we eat at Thanksgiving. This time we're going to discuss the Pilgrims and how they contributed to our celebration. All of us learned in elementary school that the Pilgrims came over in 1620 to Plymouth, Massachusetts for religious freedom. The story we learned was basically simplified for us to understand. If you think about when you're in elementary school, it's hard to understand some big, deep information. So, the Pilgrims, they were a very strict religious group. And so, of course, here I have Plymouth Rock that they carved in. Plymouth Rock is actually inside of this gazebo, which is meant to protect it from weathering. So they're a very strict religious group. They came over. They don't celebrate holidays such as Christmas and Easter because they weren't mentioned in the Bible. They arrived and they felt they had to stick together. It was going to be very harsh. So they set up this communal law in which all private possessions became community possessions. And the result of this was that they were able to survive the winter. It's not that many didn't die, but many were able to survive because they shared everything, right? And they also survived as a result of the natives into that first year. And that's the Wampanoag. And they taught them how to grow native corn in that spring. And they were different than other colonists because they actually learned from the natives. Even though they felt they were better than the natives and there was a whole thing about the land ownership, but they still learned from them and they still understood that there was a lot to learn. And at the end of the first growing season, they decided, because they had such a good harvest, that they were going to celebrate. And there's only one surviving record of this celebration, and it was written by Edward Winslow. And his letter wasn't found until the 19th century. He speaks some of the celebration. They actually, in his letter, they talk about how they sent hunters out to get fowl, which they don't know if it was turkey. They just say fowl, which it could have been pheasant, duck, or partridge. So we don't know if they actually ate turkey at that first celebration. And of course, they didn't eat all the same dishes that we eat today. His letter didn't mention cranberries or pumpkins at all. Things they might have eaten would have been fish, such as cod or bass, because the Pilgrims were big-time fishermen, so that they could actually get something and get the protein. Things that they grew were onions, corn, arugula, spinach, so those things would have been on the table. And they might have had some type of a bread on the table. And because they didn't have the pumpkins, pumpkin pie would not have been there. And of course, they didn't bring much sugar with them, and they weren't making sugar, so they would have had another type of a squash instead. Would have been this ascota squash. I couldn't find photos of it, so I don't really know what it looks like, but it's some type of a squash that they were able to stuff with things that the Indians taught them how to stuff with other berries and stuff. And of course, we always heard that the Native Americans were invited to this dinner. Well, they weren't. They arrived as a result of the Pilgrims going out and shooting off their muskets and their cannons. So the Wampanoag, they were very concerned about what was going on. So about 90 of them went, loaded down with all their weapons to Plymouth to investigate. They showed up, and it was actually a 2-to-1 ratio of natives over the Pilgrims. When they arrived, something kind of happened, and they decided it wasn't anything to worry about. Technically, the Pilgrims were not threatening them. They were just kind of letting them know they were there. So they ended up joining them in the feast. So the natives went out, did some hunting, and brought in 5 deer for the feast. So technically, and this was actually in that letter from Winslow. So technically, instead of being invited to the feast, the natives were co-hosts of the feast. It was both people feasting. And this was a one-time event. It didn't continue on and was basically forgotten for about 200 years. All right, that would be it for today. So next time we're going to talk about how Thanksgiving became a national holiday.